All right. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute here at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. We're calling this event The Future of Energy and National Security, Confronting America's Critical Minerals Challenges. We're thrilled to be hosting this amazing group of critical mineral and energy policy experts to talk about the landscape where critical minerals and the issues they're associated with them intersect with our national security interests. This event kicks off a year-long series that's going to examine the links between critical minerals and U.S. national security policy. We'll be focusing on the threat posed by China and other adversarial nation states, logistical problems magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic, and other challenges like increasing the need for U.S. manufacturing capacity and the ability of reshoring, onshoring, and friendshoring to potentially replace and supplement existing supply chains. Let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. And by the way, folks, we're going to do some questions just amongst the panelists here, and then we'll turn to you, the audience, for questions. So please have questions ready. Feel free to put them in the Q&A part of the chat, and we'll get to them about 30, 40 minutes into the conversation. So first, going from my left to right, Adina Renee Adler joined Silverado's Policy Accelerator in February 2022 as Deputy Executive Director. She leads Silverado's work on trade in the circular economy, critical mineral supply chains, and other key trade and environmental policy issues. She also works closely with the leadership team at Silverado to execute Silverado's growth effectively, to lead accelerated policy development, advancing American prosperity and global competitiveness. Adina has a long history in this space. She was previously vice president at the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, a trade association. She also served as director of global government affairs for Alcoa and Arconic, and international government relations advisor for the Shell Oil Company. So she's advised business leaders on trends in U.S. trade and international policy, including international energy policy, and previously served in the government as director for South Asia in the Office of the USTR and as an international trade specialist at the Department of Commerce. Adina has a BA in International Affairs from GW here in town, and an MA in International Economics and International Law from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and she's lived and traveled to over 80 countries. So Adina, thanks for being here with us. Immediately to Adina's right, on my screen at least, is Drew Horn. Drew is the founder and executive director of GreenMet. He's a former U.S. Army Special Forces officer. He's led U.S. efforts to assess and respond to vulnerabilities in the rare earth supply chain. He's examined these issues from many lenses, including work with the White House, the Department of Energy, and the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Drew founded GreenMet to address the overwhelming need for a sustainable and secure supply chain of rare earth metals, magnets, and green steel here in North America. And last but certainly not least, Alex Jaquez. Alex is the Special Assistant to the President for Economic Development and International Strategy at the White House at the National Economic Council. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Alex served as Senior Policy Advisor for Labor and Economic Policy on the Senate Budget Committee under Chairman Bernie Sanders from Vermont. He's previously served in a variety of policy and engagement roles for the Senate Democratic leadership in the Obama-Biden White House, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and various federal and state campaigns. Alex is a graduate of Lehigh University. So we're thrilled to have Adina, Drew, and Alex here to talk about these important issues. And again, as I mentioned earlier, folks, we're going to be coming to you in just about 20, 30 minutes for your questions. So we do want to engage you. So please do put any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the right time. So Adina, let me start with you. Historically, the U.S. has been a global leader in the mining of rare earth elements, at least through the 1980s, right? In more recent times, we've seen that drop off. Talk to us about what's altered this dynamic and what's made us so reliant on imports of rare earth elements themselves, and I think importantly, the processing of these rare earth elements.
Jamil, thank you so much for kicking us off with a softball. I appreciate that.
I'm there for you.
I think it's a really great question to examine, and honestly, I think it would take a session just uniquely on this one question. But if I could summarize it, I think you have almost like two or three things happening at the same time. One is we were the leader for so long on critical mineral development, rare earths in particular, and then I think when, in the late 70s, 80s, we started to see key environmental regulations starting to be promulgated and implemented, which had an impact on all manufacturing industries, but in particular on extractive industries. So I'm talking about, the simple Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, even the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And of course, states promulgating their own environmental regulations while also having to implement these federal rules. And so I think that really had put a lot of extra on the mining companies to really think about how do you address, what we all affectionately now call NIMBYism and NIMBY issues. And that, raises cost. And it also raised awareness for those local communities who, although might have relied on jobs, but also were starting to feel maybe the health impacts, whatever it was. I think it was that kind of congruence of issues just here in the United States that, companies had to take a step back and really evaluate and understand the complexity that it would be for mining, going future. And then I think what was happening in parallel to that was China's emergence and growth. I like to say to people that China is naturally resource poor, except ironically in rare earths. There was a discovery, and all of a sudden there was a realization that they set on a significant amount of deposit. And while at the same time you have this just dramatically emerging economy that needed all the resources of the world to be able to grow and build cities and grow its economy and feed its people, all that kind of all that going on at the same time. And as part of that resurgence, we saw China's interest to be sort of like an interim manufacturer across a whole range. So they may not have had a whole lot of natural resources, but they discovered the economic opportunity of telling the world, "Well, just send them to us. We will process it down, and then we'll send it back to you, and we'll do it for lower labor costs and all of that." And and then they realized, well, we could keep some of the material for ourselves, but they were developing that expertise, and all without having to think about NIMBYism. So I think it was kind of like you didn't see that one pendulum going this way. It was that the pendulums were going, in opposite directions, sort of at the same time.
Well, so that's really interesting. So Drew, what about that? I mean, it sounds like part of what we're hearing from Adina is, you've got environmental regs in the U.S., sort of a movement away from sort of core extractive industries, mining and the like. You've got China recognizing their own capacity, but also realizing they can serve as a processor, create jobs, create opportunity for their people, and also create a capability at home. And as these trends sort of cross one another, the U.S. lost capacity, both in terms of extracting material, but also processing it. China gained it. Given this dynamic, first of all, do you read the sort of the tea leaves the same way and the history the same way? And in either event, given where we are, how do you think about whether China has leverage on us? And if they do have leverage, how might that leverage be utilized? And what should we be concerned about in this space, Drew?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to start off, I have to agree with that general history. I think there's also been an element of just globalization of manufacturing and supply chains, which isn't necessarily a bad thing by any means. It's just a natural evolution of the market and of various industry players. As for, sort of the concept of kind of state versus state competition, obviously it's very well known that China has developed strongly in these areas. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing or necessarily a threat to the United States. It's just something that I think we need to be cognizant of. And we also need to look for ways to evolve into this kind of growing template for the world and for global manufacturing and trade in the rare earth and critical mineral space. The way I see the future going is that I think processing, separation, metallurgy, manufacturing, those are the ways of the future. I think the Chinese realize that just like we do. But I think it also gives us an opportunity from the US perspective to play catch up a little bit in terms of getting back into the game, offering newly environmentally, socially protected options, especially focusing on tech as it becomes available. And by leaning, I think, on our, what I'd say, beneficial system of accountability and transparency. So I think that in a lot of ways, what we're doing in the United States in terms of minerals development is some of the cleanest and most regulated in the world. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we're demonstrating leadership to the world in terms of development as it should be done in the right way. protecting developing nations, ensuring environmental protection, and truly, market-driven integration of the best innovation and technology. So from my perspective, that's an opportunity for us to excel and in some ways to compete to provide the best end products and the most, I would say, ethically sourced and developed products as well too. So I think one of the things that we should genuinely push for as we look to develop and to some ways compete with other alternatives on the global scale is to have the highest levels of transparency in what we're producing and to try to force that as a new global standard. And I think the globe is hungry for that. And so that's kind of my view on this. Obviously, there's a lot of pieces of this. So extraction is sort of the bedrock, not to use a pun, that all of this is based upon. There's different methods. I think we want to do it in the way that's cleanest and safest for the people doing the work, and I think we can. But I think we can use a lot of this technological development as a way for the U.S. to kind of reinsert itself as a manufacturing lead in this sector.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that makes a lot of sense, Drew. And I think your point about us trying to lead the globe, in this space in terms of both doing what we need to do for our national security, but also doing it in a way that's clean and green makes a lot of sense. Alex, the Biden administration has spent a lot of time working through this issue, obviously building on some of the work done in the prior administration on critical minerals. But this has been a real emphasis, right? The recognition, I think, by the Biden administration of the need, the effort to get legislation and get both resources and authority to move the ball down the road, and then work by the executive branch to get that money out there and start pushing forward on this stuff. How does the White House think about the economic issues, the challenges we face with potential reliance on China, and then what exactly is the administration doing, rolling out on these efforts at this point, Alex?
Yeah, thanks. So I think we, as you mentioned, are building off not just prior years and decades of bipartisan work on this issue, and so coming in, obviously knew that this was going to be a challenge that confronts our economic and national security, not the least of which as we transition to a clean energy economy. So you'll see, right, February 2021, in his first weeks in office, the president signed Executive Order 14017, America's Supply Chains, which required a supply chain review in 100 days of 4 critical products, 2 of which were critical minerals and large capacity batteries, which obviously has a lot of overlap in the critical mineral material space. And really coming out of that review, the interagency generated dozens of recommendations. They first generated a ton of vulnerabilities where we are right now with respect to single source geographical sourcing, how we let our capacity be eroded as Adina laid out over the decades to a really concerted strategy by China to capture especially the upstream and midstream in these value chains. But then they went forward with a number of recommendations that we have been methodically executing on over the last 2 years. So I think they fall broadly into 3 main buckets. One is that responsible and sustainable domestic production throughout the value chain. So both extraction, getting new sustainable extraction here under the highest labor and environmental and social standards that we can, trying to raise and lift those markets and standards across the board, as well as investing in processing and recycling. 2, working with our international partners and allies. We know, you can look at the graphs, even if we mined and recycled everything that we have here in the United States, the demand is so great, we won't meet our needs alone, and no one country will meet any of their needs alone. So especially while we are ramping up domestic production, crucial to work with partners and allies to diversify their supply chains, especially away from the PRC, but really strengthening and diversifying these global supply chains. We saw in COVID pretty starkly how one shock to the system, thinking in semiconductors, particularly where we have a concentrated geographic source, can really bring whole markets to their knees, not just impacting electronics and computing, but everything from vehicles to household appliances. So working with our allies and partners, and then digging into our regulations and permitting and mining laws, and identifying ways to both permit faster, smarter, and fairer, while upholding our bedrock environmental and labor and social standards, and also, making sure that we have a system that is both going to protect communities, protect the environment, but also provide certainty to industry and allow capital to make these investments here that we know we're going to need over the next 10 to 20 years. So kind of a three-pronged approach. And I will say we were greatly helped by the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act, all three of which you can see, not just both bipartisan and in the IRA on the Democratic side, a key focus on energy security, critical mineral security, and a pressing need to capture these supply chains.
Yeah, look, Alex, I think you're raising really important issues. I'm interested to dig in a little bit on one of these particular aspects. So, Adina mentioned sort of the historical backdrop of this and some of the sort of the changes we made in our environmental laws. And I know the administration is strongly committed to upholding our long-term environmental standards and making this transition to green energy both effective in a cost-effective way, but also environmentally sound. How do you address permitting is a good example, right? Or regulatory burden. How do you square the two, or how do you make the two hum together, right? Getting the domestic capacity, creating new extractive capacity, new processing capacity, but also ensuring that we're doing it in a way that's responsible and clean and green. How is the administration thinking about those two challenges together?
Yeah, look, the president's been clear about this, that we can do both. We can raise standards in many ways. That the United States is a global leader in environmental and responsibility standards. We can do it well at home, and really we need to prove to both the rest of the world and to ourselves that we can, and that we can also move at the speed and scale necessary to address the crisis. This is not just apparent in mining, extraction, processing, recycling, but I think really across this new clean energy economy that we're trying to build, it actually requires building, right? So the president has kicked off a permitting action plan that draws our infrastructure team, our Inflation Reduction Act team, and the whole interagency together around several critical sectors, including semiconductors, making sure we can build these $100 billion semiconductor fabrication facilities. Transmission, we're going to need exponential increase in transmission siting to be able to transmit the clean electricity that we're going to be generating. Offshore wind, it goes on and on. So we're going to need to work together. Surface issues, I think, at the barriers to generating and deploying these technologies at scale. And then also, I think one key aspect here is making sure that we have the personnel and the administrative capacity to be able to handle the vast scale of what this is going to entail. So the Inflation Reduction Act provided $1 billion in down payment on personnel and systems for permitting, which I think is incredibly foresighted on what we need to do here, and really being able to rescale the Bureau of Land Management, the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Forest Service, the people on the ground who are actually reviewing these. So we think we can do both, walk and chew gum, but we understand the imperative to move quickly here, and we want to do so in a smart and responsible fashion.
Yeah, Adina, I want to ask you about some of the stuff that Alex talked about. But before we get, and in particular, sort of this issue of permitting and thinking about how to move this ball forward, given the historical dynamics you talked about earlier. But I want to just step back for a second and come back to this question of China and the challenges that we face. Right, you noted in your earlier remarks that there was sort of an upward trend on China's capacity to both produce, to obtain critical minerals, but also to process them. And then it's sort of a systematic downturn in the U.S. capacity. How large? I know Silverado's done a lot of work on sort of trying to measure the scope of the challenge when it comes to critical minerals, which includes not just rare earth elements, but a broader range of minerals and metals that are critical to the United States, some of which go to the green economy, some of which go to our aerospace and defense sectors, all of which are central to both our economic and national security interests. So talk to us, give us a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And I do want to talk to you about sort of, these sort of larger questions about how we get to the right place in the U.S.
I mean, the magnitude is large. If we were to think about, what is it, 50 something critical minerals, and, at least 60% of them, the US is almost entirely reliant on China as a supplier for the processed material. And I have more official figures if anybody needs to ask, but the way we show that pictorially is we have a slide that, just shows all the materials, and you use bubbles to show the relative dependence on certain countries. And there's a whole lot of red on that slide, and that really, kind of shows that. And the vast majority of those materials are ores that don't exist in China. So that it's coming from other sources, around the world. So it's very significant. And I think in a lot of those materials, lithium is a great example, where we are so dependent on China that it's going to take a whole lot for us to reverse that reliance. And which comes to domestic policy and all that, to ramp up mining here, or to shore up arrangements with supplier countries around the world.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. So, Drew, one of the things that you were talking about, and I know, and Dina, we'll come back to you on this question of how we get there, but I want to turn to Drew real quick on this question of, as we're thinking about what Alex and Adina both have been talking about, which is this issue of, the challenges in doing this in a way that's clean and consistent with U.S. policies. And I know the GreenMet has been leading this effort to try and help figure out this challenge. How do we think about, reducing our reliance on China, right? And reducing the 60%, that 60% of the metals and minerals on the list, we're almost completely reliant on China. How do we do that in a way that that is green and is clean? I know you mentioned that we're a leader in the space. At the end of the day, though, we're gonna have to extract some of these minerals here, right? And we're gonna have to process a significant portion, even if we're not extracting them here, right? Whether it's lithium or cobalt or nickel or whatever else it might be, right? A lot of this is gonna come. Some it's gonna come from the US, some's gonna come from overseas. Even as we process here, how do we do that in a way that's consistent with the things that Alex and Adina both been talking about, which are some of these commitments that we've made to making this green transition?
So I think it has to be done carefully, which is, obvious thing to say, but, my thought is that there's a timeline for all of this, right? And so a lot of the challenges have been noted. I do have to thank, the leadership from the president and Alex in terms of finding ways to put tangible options on the table for, deregulation in critical areas, advocating for the cleanest, most responsible methods of extraction and processing. And I see a lot of the fruits of those efforts, but there's going to take time to get a lot of these sort of newly responsible extraction efforts in the States online. And it's going to be a distinction between different methods, and whether there is a market reward for certain methods over others. In other words, whether you're creating premium products. There's a lot of technology on the table right now to create, what you might call green steel, green metals, green other things that are more in the industrial component and area that I believe will be a premium product for a lot of the components they're going into. I think it's similar when you're looking at battery materials and rare earths going into magnet components as well. So what that means in terms of real world examples, I think we need to prioritize what gets us the greatest return for the least amount of taxation on the environment and on surrounding populations of these projects. So, for example, when it comes to lithium, we're heavily investing in projects that prioritize direct lithium extraction and other relatively reduced impact methods of extraction and processing. Similarly, on the rare side, we're prioritizing recycling and tailings reclamation and processing, as that's essentially dual purpose reuse of what would otherwise be waste and cleanup, as well as what we believe is the most effective means of producing a lot of these base materials and essentially skipping a step in the separations process. That can be done hand in hand with providing incentives for reduced kilowatt hour and things like that from some of your conventional nuclear power providers and other things of that nature that actually make it economical to engage in these things in a truly green way and to promote green hydrogen and things of that nature. And then I think it's also important to kind of rally behind what Alex and a lot of his contemporaries are doing in terms of putting public capital on the table coming from the U.S. government to serve as a capitalist, to de-risk and encourage private capital. Because I will tell you that one of the biggest things I see when I talk to investors in New York that we're working with is that they're excited about a lot of these efforts coming from Washington, and they see a new environment of the public sector looking to provide anchors and assist to them in terms of a lot of these actual deployment of capital and development of these projects. And then finally, just to the international component of this, I think we need to look to do what we can where we can, where it makes the most sense. And a lot of this, I think, is looking for relationships with friendly partners to split the processing, extraction, manufacturing, so that both entities would flourish. I know for our purposes, we look at a lot of areas that happen to be resource rich and look at ways where we can basically split the extraction, processing, separation, metallurgy, what have you, between the United States and a lot of these countries, whether these are countries such as Canada or even Greenland in our hemisphere. We're looking to South America and others where a lot of the battery materials are being produced in bulk and where they're honestly looking for an alternative to what they feel is Chinese exploitation, to be frank. So I think that we need to be creative, but I think a lot of these solutions are in front of us if we use the proper amount of problem solving and just sort of a logistical evaluation of options.
Yeah. I want to come back to this issue of friends and allies because, it's something that Alex mentioned earlier, and the importance and a pillar of the administration's approach to this is really thinking about how to work with friends and allies. Obviously the State Department has been kicking off at the White House's, request, the Mineral Security Partnership. There's a lot of work going on in this space. But Adina, I want to ask you about that before I come to Alex. I know Alex has got a lot to say on this issue. Talk to us about how we should be thinking about the sort of the friends and allies, right? It's easy to say, hey, we've got folks that can do this, right? They can do the processing, they can do the extraction, right? I mean, how do those relationships look today? What work needs to be done in that space? You obviously have worked in the international trade realm for a long time. So Adina, how do you think about that friends and allies piece of this effort?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, there's surprisingly, there's actually two ways to look at it, but I'm gonna start with the obvious, which is, we have free trade agreements with a number of countries, a number of resource-rich countries. That is a great place to start. Some of the agreements could use some modernization, and what better way than in the area of critical minerals. So, USMCA doesn't necessarily need modernization, but let's start with that. Canada and Mexico sharing land borders, and we don't have to worry about transportation costs in terms of price, as well as the cost on the environment. And those are natural partners, and they both also have resources. And the good news is we already have, the Defense Procurement Act includes Canada. So, we have some of that structure there. And then how do we maybe translate some of that structure into our agreement with Chile, or with Australia, or Peru, where that's just a foundation to start with, where we already have those agreements, and we can maybe just improve upon them by focusing on shoring up these supplies. Yeah. And then now we see that the administration just announced, or the president announced on Friday, that the US and EU are going to think about, what an agreement could look like. It's for purposes of the IRA, but it does encourage good transatlantic collaboration, because they're also vying for the same limited resources, and they need to shore up their supplies, and they want to reduce their reliance on China and other places. So, creating that partnership could be really, really helpful. And then the sort of unnatural way of looking at this is, and I just want to sort of build on what Drew was saying earlier, is when you think about what that energy mix looks like in the future, could also impact upon the demand for critical minerals. Having an expectation that our future energy mix is going to be entirely based on renewable is going to put pressures on that critical mineral demand. But if we have a much more diverse basket of energy solutions where, fossil fuels still has some role, but we think about geothermal, we think about nuclear, we think about hydropower and long-term battery storage and all of these things. When you add in a much more diverse basket, the demand for critical minerals actually comes down, and as a result, you're in a better position, as the U.S. is in a better position to work with our friends and allies to come up with those supply agreements, whatever they look like, whether it's building on the free trade agreement or coming up with another type of agreement. And just to, close this point at home, according to, data that we just got from the IEA and data from the US Department of Energy and some of our own analysis, the demand for some of these critical minerals could be as much as, 20 to 50% of the world's supply. But if you have a much more diverse basket of energy solutions, then your demand goes way down. So instead of 20% of a particular material from Australia, we can go to them and say we only need 3%, and they may be more willing to negotiate with us because we're not trying to take everything off their land, So I think that's just a way of just viewing how we can work with friends and allies. But if we have a broader mix, then the pressure to be shopping for those materials is a little bit lessened.
Yeah, Alex, I want to ask you about this broader mix. I know that, we've talked a lot about this. You mentioned offshore wind, right? Obviously, nuclear has to be part of the conversation. It's obviously a controversial issue, not just in the United States, but around the globe. But thinking about, friends and allies, before we get to the sort of the mix of energy that we need to really make this work effectively, I know the administration has worked, in partnership with our allies, and we've got the Mineral Security Partnership that's spinning up at the State Department. Talk to us about, though, these challenges that we've had with the EU, right? The EU has gotten pretty frustrated with sort of our policy to prioritize domestic production, our policy to prioritize access to minerals from free trade countries. It sounds like the administration, according from what Adina says, you've got some ongoing efforts to work that through. Obviously, don't want to get into stuff you can't get into, but is there anything you can talk to us about how you all are thinking about some of these challenges, both with our allies that we've got good relationships with on these issues and are able to rely on to help produce some of the stuff, and then some of the challenges that we face with some of our, historic partners?
Yeah, sure. So I think, bottom line, the Inflation Reduction Act is something we're very proud of, and we think is going to generate benefits not just for the United States but for the globe, right? So as we are, putting a race to the top, so to speak, on clean energy deployment, and really for the first time, the president is able to stand on the world stage and say the United States is on track to meet our climate commitments. We think it's a big deal in terms of our global shared objective, which of course is to combat our shared enemy of climate change. So so on the baseline, we also think it's integral to build out a domestic industry in many of these places, as our supply chain review and industrial strategy has led us to. We believe we've offshored too much of this capacity. We've let too much of this capacity be offshored. IP and things we invented here, the photovoltaic cell, the lithium-ion battery, that we invented in the U.S. and now let China, dominate world production of. We want to bring that back home, and we're being intentional about it. Same on critical minerals. We have an expectation. We have a strategy here to expand our domestic production here at home while we are working with our partners and allies to diversify our global mix, right? So we think it's all part and parcel of one shared goal, which is, of course, fighting climate change. I would say with our trading partners, I think the statement with the EU on the purposes of the 30D clean vehicle credit, that does have that allowance for mine and process materials from allied countries. We're going to be, we've committed to kick off discussions on how to work some sort of agreement to allow those minerals to qualify. And then also, another piece there was kind of a table where we can talk about our investment strategies and make sure that the investment strategies we're pursuing, the EU Green Deal, industrial policy, the things that have been proposed over there, make sure that they're working together, they're mutually reinforcing. And we think, if you look at where we are versus where we need to be, we are at the starting line on the amount of capacity that we're going to have to reach over the next 10, 20, 30 years. There's going to be more than enough for global players, and we need global players to be integral in this process. So we're racing full steam ahead, and we want our allies and partners to run with us, and setting up dialogues and forums where we can do so in a mutually reinforcing way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Drew, how are you all thinking about your investment structure when it comes to sort of domestic investment and and extraction here versus extraction overseas, processing here versus processing overseas, and friends and allies. How are you all thinking about that dynamic as you all look out on the horizon and think about where to make those smart investments?
Well, for us, we come at this from a slightly unorthodox perspective where we're trying to directly align with a lot of the U.S. policy goals coming from the government. That may be in part kind of my government background. But I think there's a real opportunity there, to be frank. And so, with the incentives that are on the table now coming from the White House and with the congressional support behind those, we definitely put a priority and a premium on any U.S. projects first. Anything we can do here that's economical is going to be the one we're going to look at first. And then we kind of build out from there if it makes sense. So, from the Green Met perspective, we've done a lot of U.S.-Canadian collaboration. We're actively pursuing possible projects in Mexico for the same reason. We've got Green Atlantic projects based off proximity and shared national security interests. And the same thing with various countries in South America. We also look at opportunities globally. I don't think it's any secret to anyone that a lot of the actual rare materials in terms of bulk are located on the African continent, as well as in parts of Asia. And so we want to see those opportunities move forward in ways where the U.S. is providing investment and where the U.S. is doing a lot of the actual follow-on processing and manufacturing that comes from those feedstock streams. My thought is you have to look at what can be done given the current environment. And so I think there's a lot of work that's being led by the administration in terms of opening up new responsible regulatory areas for development inside the United States, but some of it's going to take some time, to be frank. So I've got one project that we're looking at that essentially could provide, zinc and copper immediately from a South American country, in a way that meets their needs and meets ours, where we could look to immediately build a clean refinery in the States to actually process it. And maybe someday that'll be augmented from, ideally sourced materials from the United States or from Canada, but we have to kind of start with what's on the market now. And that's kind of our model. But as much as of it that we can actually house here, as far as, the full, ideally vertically aligned supply chain, the better. I think one of the projects that we're aligning behind that we're proudest of is where we're looking from essentially going from tailings reclamation to magnet production on the rare earth side, because that can basically be entirely done inside the United States. Fortunately, with a lot of great support from the administration and U.S. government, but done in a way where I think we're creating a premium product that truly is done in the most environmental and socially responsible manner. That actually makes sense from an economic perspective. There's a lot of people working to make that happen. There's a lot of efforts on the Hill and in the market that are opening up these new doors. But from our perspective, everything we can do in the United States, we always try and prioritize there first.
I think that makes a lot of sense. By the way, for the audience, it is almost time for your questions. So please jump in into the Q&A box. Give us your questions. We'll come around to you here in just a minute. So please drop some in there. I can keep going with asking these guys questions, this team questions all day long. So, Alex, one of the things that Drew was mentioning was this issue of how you think about the mix in priorities, friends and allies versus, investment here in the U.S. and the administration, obviously with the authorities, the Inflation Reduction Act, the resources provided, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and the CHIPS Act is making big bets here in the United States, right? Semiconductors is one area, obviously, but in critical minerals in particular, right? There have been some big grants announced. You guys are actively using the DPA, using the loan authority at DOE. Talk to us about what we might see coming next. The president obviously had a big announcement with the DPA. There have been a couple of deals done, right? Should we expect to see more extraction under DPA authority? Should we expect to see more grants coming on the processing side? What do we expect to see in terms of loans? The loans, seems to be, there have been a couple of big announcements, but only a handful, right? What do you see coming down the pike over the next 6 months or a year as the administration sort of ramps up its effort under these existing authorities to expand U.S. domestic production and processing in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, building off, again, going back to the supply chain recommendation, I think the clear through line, on battery and many of our clean energy critical mineral space was we want to create an end-to-end domestic supply chain for where we have the resources. So you've seen that, I think, play out in the various funding streams and programs that we've been able to utilize. I think if you just look at the loan programs office, I mean, over the last 6 months, this is an entity that didn't make a loan for 10 years or a loan guarantee in 10 years. And under the Biden administration, just in the last 6 months, has provided a loan to Ioneer in Nevada to process their mined lithium on site into lithium carbonate. Just recently to Redwood Materials in Nevada to recycle end of life material into cathode and anode material. Ultium, 3 facilities in Ohio, Michigan, and Tennessee to manufacture battery cells, and Syrah Resources in Louisiana to take feedstock graphite from Mozambique and process it into active anode materials. So just in the loan programs office, we've hit every single link in the battery supply chain just in the last 6 months. Nearly $3 billion out of the infrastructure law in the kind of more upstream, midstream pieces where we currently lack, any domestic production. In many of those spaces where DOE is investing, we, if these facilities, get up and running to capacity and operational, we will go from 0% production to 4, 5, 6% depending on the link in the supply chain. And then you mentioned DoD DPA, which is kind of our ability to get farthest upstream in the supply chain. At the end of last year, issued an award for Perpetua Resources in Idaho. They have more due diligence and awards coming through as well. So I think you've seen it from soup to nuts, really here. The farthest up in the supply chain, in the mining and extraction, all the way to recycling, as well as efforts to catalyze next generation, right? So innovative and next gen technologies, especially extraction technologies like extraction from brine, substitute materials using silicon, more silicon than graphite, take our that demand down if we're able to substitute out some of these rarer materials or those more concentrated in specific areas, right? So you're seeing a lot of cobalt substitution from the battery manufacturers, how we're supporting that. So I think you'll continue to see awards throughout the supply chain here. And then, especially where we still have funding on the table in the infrastructure law and DPA to come through as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So Adina, I did say I would come back to you on this question of regulatory reform and the like. And then I do want to go to audience questions. I see there's some audience questions there. But Adina, do you think we're doing enough on regulatory reform? What else would you want to see us doing? How is Silverado thinking about sort of actionable things that might go to what, there's been a lot of talk about we've got this permitting process reform going on. There's a lot of stuff in train. What is that you all are looking at that you want to see sort of happen in the near term to really sort of, Alex has pointed out all the good money they're putting to work. Are there other things that the administration or that a following administration or Congress could be doing, frankly, in the space to move the ball forward?
Yeah, I mean, we're not focused entirely on regulatory, like we're looking at the whole picture, but there are sometimes it's behavioral decisions or it's a policy or things like that. Sure. And I already touched on earlier about thinking about what the energy mix looks like in the future. But I think there's also, and Alex has brought up a couple of times where there's a focus on recycling of critical minerals, but there isn't enough of research and development in this space. So lithium recycling is certainly well along, aluminum and copper recycling are certainly well along, and cobalt and nickel to some extent too, but none of the other critical minerals has really been had a focus on researching what recycling looks like, how to do that, and then how do you scale that up. And so I think it's thinking about recycling, if it's thinking about what are the alternative materials. We see that there is battery development that doesn't use cobalt as an example, but what else could be out there? Or is there a stock, do we need to do more stockpiling, and how do we do that? What does that look like? Which of course does create costs to the government. So I think they would rather not do that as much as they possibly can. So I think it's that. And then also, I think there also needs to be some sort of a whole of government. I think there is sort of a whole of government approach coming out of the
Yeah.
White House, certainly, where Alex is definitely leading the charge. But one of the things that we're hearing from private sector companies is that they still don't entirely know who's like a central point of contact to
Yeah.
really stitch everything together. And
Yeah.
by that, I mean somebody that they can call. Who can they call and say, I'm considering this project. Does it fit within, your strategy? I think, there might be a regulatory tweak that holds us back from making this investment. Have you ever considered that? And then you have that person who can really go to the agencies and say, how do we make this work? And so I think that, would also help unlock some of, I think unlock some of the misunderstanding of what the strategy is here holistically and thinking about securing these supplies.
Yeah. There's always talk about the government having a czar to do one of the things, and there's always been a question whether we need a critical mineral czar. I won't put that to you, Alex, but let me ask you this. So Josh Birnbaum, one of our guests, asked about the mineral security partnership. We talked about that a little bit earlier. You mentioned it. Is it? Josh wants to know: is this more of a theoretical engagement, or is there real? What can we show? Is there anything to show tangibly that MSP is kicking off and really getting rolling?
Yeah, great question. So, I think the Mineral Security Partnership and the work that the State Department is doing has truly been integral in doing some of that kind of coordinating that you mentioned, Adina, especially on the international front, where, of course, this has you know how many different agencies it touches here in the United States. Imagine that multiplied over dozens and dozens of partners and allies, right? So we have a central place where we can kind of connect, track, share data, share progress, and have a convening forum to raise these issues. I would say on the concrete side, the Mineral Security Partnership is tracking, I think, more than a dozen, I think up to 16 now, projects, both in partner countries and in third countries, where the arrangements are, it's kind of adopt a project where a country will take a leading role and then bring both private and public authorities where they have them, but also bring in second and third countries who can team up to better advance these projects along. This is helpful, especially of course in the financing space, where we have mechanisms like the Export-Import Bank and the Development Finance Corporation. Some countries, Japan, has a very robust kind of foreign investment arm here. These are the kinds of deals that the Mineral Security Partnership, and working closely alongside the G7 effort, the Partnership on Global Infrastructure and Investment, to make these kinds of concrete, tangible investments. I will say 100% across the administration, we're focused on deployment and concrete outcomes. So trying to, I think I don't want to tease too much, but in the coming weeks, you'll see more from MSP in particular. But they are on the ground and working in very specific projects and specific minerals that we've targeted. So expect more to come there.
You can't say that and not give us a little bit more, Alex. It's very tempting. So Drew, we've got a couple of questions on cobalt. So I should say, before I ask you a question about cobalt, I do sit on the advisory board of a strategic metals company, U.S. Strategic Metals, that does cobalt and nickel here in the U.S. recycling, processing, and the like, and extraction. So, but so these questions are not from my end. But so Mark Providera asks about the DRC and the fact that they have 6% of global cobalt resources critical for EV batteries, and thus for competition with China. He talks about an MOU that we signed recently with Zambia and the DRC to secure this particular value chain. But he raises the point that Lawfare notes as of yesterday that DRC may be considered a pivot to Russia. How should we, Mark, also, how should we think about DRC and this potential Russia pivot in the context of this need for cobalt, particularly as we make this transition to EV batteries that have cobalt oftentimes at the core of their chemistry?
So it's not easy. There's a lot of complications in a variety of countries in terms of verification of ethical sourcing of various materials. So DRC is a commonly used example and a commonly brought up opportunity with some complications. So it's obviously well known that there's vast amounts of cobalt and other battery and magnet materials, for that matter, in DRC and in Central Africa. Right. I think the PRC is well aware of it. I've heard a joke that there's one country's name that you can't say in front of a PRC official without having all attention sort of snap onto you, and that's DRC supposedly. So I think they're aware of the value, as are the Russians. So it's a little bit of a repetition of some of the sort of updated great gamesmanship in terms of pursuit of these new green materials, if you will. How we look at it has to be enforcing our standards in a way that provides a true incentive for others globally to want to, I would say, meet them. And so by that, I mean, we essentially need to effectively enforce and incentivize the transparency of how these materials are sourced. And so, especially when you have countries where there's vast amounts of raw material wealth and potential, but there's a lot of logistical and at times, security issues, other things of that nature, there needs to be essentially a replication of some of the sourcing we do for other materials, and obviously the Kimber process and other things are helpful in trying to determine that these materials are sourced in a manner where they can be developed in the United States the way we want to. But I think we need to look at expansion of some of those programs. I kind of think that, in the 90s, there was questions about the sourcing of some precious materials and how they made their way into things like engagement rings. And then, essentially what happened was a transparency cycle that drove towards these premium products. And I think we need to replicate that in a way where we have funding and private capital that's rewarding those that are doing things the right way. And then I think what will happen is that we will end up sort of outcompeting some of these other state entities that may not be complying with some of these, same sort of accountable methods, if you will. So I think when we talk about trying to outcompete Russian expansion and influence, or same thing with the PRC or other competitors, the more we have verification that we're sourcing things the right way and enforcing the standards that we like to talk about, and then potentially that's going to produce premium products. Just throw out a hypothetical. You could look at potentially upselling an EV that has verification that all its lithium was sourced in the most responsible manner, and helped actually with some of the value add development in some of those areas. Because I think with a lot of the capital and development, there can be civil related evolution and expansion. And so I think the more that's incentivized and the more we use market solutions to try and drive that, or we're going to outcompete some of our potential, state competitors. Aside from that, there's ways of using various other tools on the government side. Obviously we hear a lot of people talking about in those areas, whether there's need or sort of the case for expansion of some of our bases and military infrastructure in areas that are, I would say, more sort of open or more explored by Chinese and PRC elements at this time. I don't think we want to get into a habit of trying to base our commercial development in areas only where there is U.S. security mechanisms, especially in areas that tend to be unstable. But that's something we hear from time to time. I personally believe that free market competition and basically driving meritocracy and the best solutions is the best way for us to expand and for lack of a better term, to win in this sector and in this area. But that's how we base our business model, which is trying to have maximum accountability and transparency and to create a premium product at the end of the day because of that.
Yeah. So Dina, one of our audience members asked about whether sort of the challenges that we see with the EU in light of the Inflation Reduction Act, which obviously Alex and the team are making efforts to sort of address. They wonder whether we're not just running into the same trade and industrial policy issues that we've had historically between the U.S. and Europe over Boeing and Airbus, just different industries. Do you see it that way? I mean, you've done international trade and worked at commerce, working on these issues. I mean, do you see that same dynamic going on here? Is this really just a new version of Boeing, Airbus, just in a different industry?
It's a great question, so I'm kind of glad it came up. But my short answer is I have no idea. Only because I have no idea what this agreement is going to look like. I think there's going to be some of the same issues, but it also might be something completely different because Boeing, Airbus are, essentially the only two major producers of a product that is used globally. And so they were and are constantly in a race, to sell their product. Whereas here, in a way, it's a little bit one-sided, where Europe is just eager to be a part, a guest at the party, whatever that means, that was created by the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think that there's going to have to be a negotiation that includes, what it is that, how it is that they can get themselves that invitation, So I think it's going to be kind of like a mix of, yes, we've seen this before, and oh, that's something new. But other than that, I have no idea. I think one of the things we're looking in the transatlantic relationship right now, is this global arrangement on steel. And I think that will probably create some interesting lessons that could be applied in a critical mineral agreement of some sort.
Yeah. Adina, I want to follow up on a question that comes from Congressman Robert Pittenger. He asked about standards, right? He says, look, the Russians and Chinese don't care about standards. This is an issue that you raised earlier. How are we going to raise the standards for the rest of the world and still compete? I mean, it's something that Drew and Alex have talked about, and aspirationally, of course, it makes sense. Is this a practical reality? I think Congressman Pittenger is a good question there.
No, it's a fantastic question. And I do think it'll take time, unfortunately, which is never the answer that anybody wants to hear.
Drew made that point.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of creating high quality standards is to create a business case that disincentivizes the other scenario of not having high quality standards, not taking community and human health and the environment into consideration. And part of that, it's not just in how do we mine the materials and how do we produce them, but it gets into a social consciousness where, manufacturers and really just the general population, the demand for greener or more sustainable products grows so much that there's more incentive, more business, more return on the investment, for those products, thus disincentivizing the supply chains and the products that come from those that are not as green and as sustainable. And it's not easy, but it does take time. And I think it was Drew who made the comment that very early on, that there are countries that would prefer to do business with the United States and with the West, knowing that they bring in these higher quality standards, but for some of the free renminbi, that is sort of waved in front of their face.
Yeah. Well, look, I know we're at the top of the hour. I do want to wrap up, but Alice, I want to give you the last word, right? Adina's laid out a really compelling case for being able to do this, and Drew made the same points earlier, or similar points earlier. Can we actually do this? Can we square these two things and make it happen? And give us the last line from the White House on that question.
Yeah, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think we could, right? It's a challenge. I think many of our priorities that we've set out are challenges, and we have a number of them that we've overcome, I think, over to the surprise of many, as the president will note, to many of our detractors. So I think what's really exciting about this space in particular is the engagement we have, from our NGO community and our civil society, from labor, from the private sector, from the OEMs and the automakers, all the way through the supply chain, the mining companies, and the processing and recycling. Folks know that it's going to take some time, and there's going to be bumps along the road. I know, on just one quick kind of anecdote here, we hosted a meeting at the White House on the anniversary of the General Mining Law of 1872. In May, it was the 150th anniversary of this law, and we brought everybody together. We brought the mining companies along with tribes and with NGOs and with our automakers to sit around the table for what most folks had said was the first time they've ever been in one room talking about
Yeah.
really hard issues. And the only way we're going to solve hard issues is solving them together. So that's what we've been trying to do here at the White House is bringing in and across the administration, bringing in the best minds, both inside and out, to drive at this. And I think we've started to see results. And it's gonna take a lot more effort and a lot more time to bring it to fruition. But I'm confident.
Awesome. Well, listen, thanks, Alex, to you and to Drew and Adina for being here with us today. Thanks to our audience for being here and joining us and staying for a couple of minutes longer. Just a couple of reminders on Thursday, March 30th from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. as part of our NSI's Global Repression Policy Program. We're excited to host an event about China's digital authoritarianism and how it's used as a tool for the PRC's repressive efforts globally. Registration's on our website. Also on Thursday, March 30th from 12 to 1, our Cyber and Tech Center is going to be hosting a panel discussion on the Hill on assessing Shields Up. And Thursday, April 12th from 12 to 1, we're going to have a panel discussion on countering China's global tech ambition. Please join us for those events. Also, please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at Mason Natsek. And don't forget to check out our awesome podcast, Fault Lines, where myself, Jessica Jones, and Les Munson get us up to speed 8 minutes a week, 8 minutes, 3 times a week on national security issues. Thanks for joining us. Adina, Drew, Alex, thanks for being here. Have a great day, everybody.